The spring of 2025 saw a dramatic U.S. policy shift on the Ukraine war. After nearly 3 years of Washington's unwavering support for Kyiv against Russia's invasion, the newly elected administration of President Donald Trump abruptly changed course. Trump had campaigned on a promise to end the conflict within 24 hours of taking office, a pledge later adjusted to achieving peace within his first 100 days. In practice, those 100 days were marked by intense pressure on Ukraine to negotiate, a flurry of back-channel diplomacy, and a notable reluctance to demand concessions from Russia. This represented a sharp reversal from the previous U.S. stance and set the stage for contentious developments in April-May 2025. One of Trump's first moves was to reach out directly to Moscow. In February, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Riyadh to discuss ending the war, after Trump had spoken with Vladimir Putin and agreed to pursue peace talks without consulting European allies. Trump even hinted he might soon meet Putin in Saudi Arabia as part of this initiative. This unilateral diplomacy, cutting out NATO partners and Ukraine initially, alarmed allied capitals. European leaders and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky warned they would not recognize any deal made behind their backs. No decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz underscored that a dictated peace imposed on Ukraine would never find our support. Trump's administration soon put heavy pressure on Ukraine to come to the table. A late February Oval Office meeting between Trump and Zelensky was reportedly disastrous, ending with Trump temporarily freezing U.S. military aid and intelligence sharing to force Kyiv's cooperation. In the weeks that followed, Ukraine yielded to several U.S. demands. Notably, Zelensky's government dropped its precondition that all Russian troops leave Ukrainian territory before any negotiations. Kyiv also agreed, in principle, to a U.S.-brokered 30-day ceasefire, a full, unconditional pause in fighting, as a first step toward peace. Moscow, however, refused to reciprocate on that longer ceasefire, even as it declared short temporary truces which it repeatedly violated with continued strikes. Throughout this period, Trump avoided pressuring Russia on its war aims and instead publicly suggested that Ukraine needed to be more reasonable. In an interview, he signaled willingness to legitimize Russia's hold on Crimea, saying, "Crimea will stay with Russia," effectively accepting Moscow's 2014 annexation. This comment confirmed that Trump's peace plan involved significant Ukrainian territorial concessions. Meanwhile, the scope and terms of U.S. support to Ukraine changed markedly. The halt in military aid after the February clash sent a clear signal that Washington's assistance was no longer unconditional. A senior Trump official even blamed Ukraine itself for the pause in U.S. military and intelligence support. Although some aid flows eventually resumed once Ukraine complied with Trump's requests, the White House made it clear that future assistance hinged on Ukraine's cooperation in peace efforts. High-end weapon deliveries were slowed or put on hold, and U.S. officials hinted that if Ukraine refused a reasonable deal, critical arms like air defenses might be withheld. Diplomatically, Trump also sought highly visible meetings to showcase progress. On April 26th, he met Zelensky at the Vatican, an unusual summit on neutral ground that Trump hailed as productive, noting that the Ukrainian leader seemed calmer afterward. By late April, however, Trump was growing frustrated with the lack of a breakthrough. He publicly urged Putin to stop shooting, sit down and sign a deal, even as Russian forces continued deadly bombardments. Members of Trump's team warned they might withdraw U.S. mediation if Moscow did not show more flexibility. In sum, Washington's focus shifted to brokering a quick truce, even if that meant pressing Ukraine to accept painful compromises, while refraining from any new punitive steps against Russia. European allies reacted with dismay to this abrupt change in U.S. policy. Accustomed to close coordination with Washington, NATO and EU partners found themselves sidelined. In mid-February, French President Emmanuel Macron convened a meeting in Paris with leaders of Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, Denmark, the Netherlands, and EU and NATO officials to formulate a united response. Allies uniformly backed Ukraine's stance that any peace deal must respect Ukraine's sovereignty and be decided with Ukraine, not above it. Officials from London to Berlin voiced concern that Trump might sell Ukraine down the river in a great power bargain with Putin. Europe's fear was not only the potential sacrifice of Ukrainian territory, but also the precedent of the U.S. undermining the rules-based order. NATO's Secretary General affirmed the alliance was ready and willing to support Ukraine and defend member states, implicitly pushing back against Trump's earlier suggestion that America might selectively honor NATO's Article 5 obligations. At the same time, European countries began boosting their own defense posture. By March, EU leaders had coalesced around plans to dramatically increase collective defense spending, reportedly by as much as $800 billion, and to invest more in arms for Ukraine to make up for wavering U.S. support. This reflected a strategic shift, Europe preparing to shoulder more of the security burden as Washington's reliability came into question. Ukraine's leadership, for its part, responded with a mix of public defiance and pragmatic adjustment. President Zelensky and his government continued to emphasize that any peace must be strong and lasting, built on ending Russian aggression and securing firm guarantees for Ukraine's safety. Kyiv circulated its own peace proposal, calling first for a full ceasefire along current front lines, to be followed by negotiations on disputed territories, an approach aiming to freeze the fighting without immediately conceding land. This plan, backed by many in Europe, stood in stark contrast to the U.S. settlement terms reported in late April, which included de jure recognition of Russia's control of Crimea and even the lifting of sanctions imposed on Moscow since 2014. Still, Zelensky had little choice but to engage in Trump's peace process to avoid losing vital U.S. support. His administration made the painful decision to bend on certain red lines in hopes of preserving the alliance. Ukrainian officials also sought to deepen ties with remaining supportive allies and welcomed envoys like Trump's Ukraine negotiator Keith Kellogg to ensure Kyiv's voice was heard. All the while, ordinary Ukrainians endured relentless Russian attacks through April, even during purported ceasefires, underscoring why Kyiv was skeptical of any deal not coupled with enforcement mechanisms. By the end of May 2025, the consequences of America's abrupt U-turn were reverberating across the region and the world. The unity of the Western alliance had been put to the test. Europe's scramble to fortify its defenses and keep Ukraine supported signaled a new era of reduced reliance on Washington, a historic shift in transatlantic relations. Within NATO, Trump's conditional commitment to collective defense raised doubts that could weaken deterrence against further aggression. The prospect of a U.S.-brokered peace that legitimizes Russia's land grab set a worrisome precedent. It suggested that large powers can rewrite borders by force and then be rewarded with sanctions relief and diplomatic normalization. Such an outcome, analysts warned, would erode international law and possibly embolden other authoritarian leaders to defy norms. Eastern European nations, feeling exposed, began planning for their own security more urgently, while countries like China watched closely how the West handled Russia's challenge. In Ukraine itself, any imposed settlement that fails to deliver justice could prove unstable, a recipe for future conflict. In sum, the sharp shift in U.S. policy in April-May 2025 introduced new uncertainties into the Ukraine war and the global order. While it aimed to halt the bloodshed swiftly, it also risked undermining the very principles of collective security and sovereignty that have underpinned regional stability since the end of the Cold War.